Mapping Chester's landscapes, past, present and future. And what I thought I would do is talk for about, well, I guess it'll be about 40 minutes or so. I hope that's okay with everybody. And there'll be some time for questions at the end as well, which is to getting some comments and feedback and some ideas and thoughts and so on. So as Diane was saying, this is actually a joint lecture between the Chester Society for Landscape History. So it's great to be back again with the Society, and also the Historic Towns Trust. So I appreciate as well having this opportunity to bring the Trust into dialogue with the Society on this occasion. So my talk then this evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Me wearing two hats. First of all, a hat as a historical geographer at Queen's University, Belfast. Just in case you want to see what I look like instead of on a Zoom screen, with a little younger than I am now, but some of you may recognise even where that photograph was taken. So I wear two hats as a professor of historical geography at Queen's University, Belfast, and also as the chair of the Historic Towns Trust. And one of the things I want to do this evening is try and draw together three projects. The titles of those projects are there, all funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council over a considerable period of time, actually. The first project was a comparative project looking at the new towns of Edward I. And of course, they are not a million miles from Chester. So that'll be one thing which will be featured here. The project, which obviously sort of sits at the heart of a lot of this, is Mapping Medieval Chester from about 10 years ago. And that involved Helen Fulton, actually, and others as well, as you'll see in a minute. And then the third project, which built upon Mapping Medieval Chester, was called Discover Medieval Chester, which was a close collaboration with the Grosvenor Museum, where we enjoyed a lot of interesting activities in and around Chester. So I'm going to be drawing together those three projects, and in fact, it's a common strand to those three projects. They kind of all share a common interest in maps and mappings, which is appropriate enough, of course, if I'm talking about mapping Chester's landscapes. So drawing together these three projects and looking at the common thread, then Mapping Medieval Chester itself, there's the project team with Helen, and Mark Faulkner was the postdoc, and Catherine Clark, who's now at in London, University of London. And we ran a whole series of different activities in and around Chester as part of that project, which was great fun. As I said, mapping was really a key to this. Mapping in terms of the sources we were using as part of this project to understand medieval Chester more especially, and to bring greater awareness of its significance as a medieval city. So we were using maps, historic maps as sources, but another key part or key component of that Mapping Medieval Chester and Discover Medieval Chester project was to create new maps as well. So we produced maps as outputs, and as an example of that, one of those here. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more this evening about maps as sources, as historic sources, which are really important to us if we want to understand the past, but also thinking about how we can use maps to visualize complex geographical information, which actually urban landscapes are complex geographical information. So it's thinking about maps as sources, as historic sources, but also thinking about maps as a way of visualizing landscapes, which will be a kind of common theme to this. So creating new maps like the one we're looking at here. And there is scope to, I would like to suggest, and one of the reasons for promoting this particular lecture at the moment is the scope that exists, I hope, for revisiting some of these projects and some of the maps and mappings of 10 years ago or so. And that relates to my other hat that I wear, which is as the chair of the Historic Towns Trust, and the possibility I would like to promote during the course of this evening, and subsequently perhaps as well, if people are interested, is the idea of having an atlas, a historic towns atlas of Chester. So I thought I ought to say what a historic towns atlas is. And so I've got here some of our recent atlases, appropriately enough, actually, like Chester itself, featuring Roman cities of Roman origin, like Winchester there, and then also on the right-hand side here, you should just see in a minute, York. So these are the kinds of volumes that are produced under this title, the British Historic Towns Atlas, and we're always looking for new opportunities. I think Chester would be an absolutely marvelous addition to our series of British Historic Towns Atlases, partly because of the work that I've already been doing over the years, but also because it's a really important city, of course. It has hugely important heritage. It has a lot of visitors. It has a very interested local population. And indeed, it's a city that punches above its weight in terms of its contribution to national history, but also as an example of a city which has been around for quite a considerable amount of time. So it has also a lot of academic interest, as those projects of ours underline. So the British Historic Towns Atlases are looked after by a trust, the Historic Towns Trust, and it's that I'm the chair of. And we are really the kind of umbrella organization for these production of these atlases. This is the little extract, as you can see there. I'm sure you'll recognize it, of York and the Historic Towns Atlas of York, produced by Peter Addyman and colleagues there. The Historic Towns Atlases themselves go back quite a number of years. In fact, the first of these in the series was published in 1969 under the editorship of Mary LaBelle. And it's really thanks to Mary LaBelle's endowment of the trust that we can keep functioning as a charitable organization. The first volume there included a whole series of different towns and cities, but our tendency these days is to just have one atlas per city. And then within that volume, there was a map, which you can see here, which shows the ambition of at the time of producing atlases for historic towns across Great Britain. Ireland now is dealt with by the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. So in 1969, there was a whole host of towns and cities covered in volume 1, including places not too distant, actually, from Chester, in terms of being in the Welsh marches, including Hereford. But you'll also see a whole range of places, Reading, Nottingham. And since then, this map has filled out. So we now have an atlas of London. We have an atlas coming out soon for Oxford. Bristol was published. Coventry was published. York, as you've seen, Norwich was published. So we're filling out the map slowly but surely. And this is the kind of reason why I think we need to have a little think about new possibilities for the future. We want to keep momentum going. So what do these things look like? Well, this is quite an older Historic Towns Atlas now from Hereford, but I thought it might be of interest since it's a march town as well, like Chester, founded under or developed under the March of Lords, of course. But it also indicates on the right-hand side some of the characteristics of our atlases, the use of standardized mapping scales, which is something I'll be referring to later on, of 1 to 2500, or 25 inches to 1 mile in old money, if you prefer. That there are maps produced to common standards, comparable conventions of cartography. And the reason for that is because these atlases form part of an international European-wide program of historic towns atlases. So the idea, this was created in the 1950s in the post-war era, that each country of Europe would have a national atlas program, and these atlases would promote and explore the rich heritage of Europe's historic towns and cities. So as you can see from this map here by Sarah Gearty from the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, a map of European Historic Towns Atlas projects, that there are some gaps on the map and we need to fill out those gaps, and not least in Great Britain, as you can see. The red dots there indicate the location of atlases, and that there are some considerable gaps, not least in Wales, in the southwest of England, in northern England, including the northwest of England, of course, and also into Scotland as well. So we're busy as a trust trying to redress those gaps in our coverage. And the whole point here is to be able to compare one place with another place. And it's something that's been very successfully achieved by our friends, well, on the island of Ireland, which is where I am, of course, because I'm in Queen's University, Belfast, but the Irish Historic Towns Atlases, which cover the whole of the island of Ireland, north and south, and a very ambitious programme and very successful programme led by the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. And the maps for the Irish Historic Towns Atlas are comparable to those of the other European Historic Towns Atlases, enabling us to then compare one place with another place, to explore comparative urban history, urban archaeology, and urban geography. So I thought looking at Dublin here was quite a good case in point, with the close historical connections, of course, between Chester and Dublin in the past. And this map shows, it's an attempt to try and show the growth phases of Dublin in the period during the early Middle Ages, and shows the Gaelic Dublin and Viking Dublin and so on. So this is the power of maps in these atlases. They enable us to visualize complex geographical information about the patterns of urban growth and development, for example. They emphasize to us as well the importance of legacy, of continuity, of the fact that features from the past also survive into the present day. They are part of our urban heritage. So maps and atlases like these are very important to us, and also academically, for research purposes, for teaching purposes, for informing ourselves of the importance of this past and how and why towns and cities have developed and why they're still with us today. So these are big themes, and we can explore these through maps. And this is the point of our historic towns atlases. There are different ways we can visualize urban change over time. We can use period growth maps like the one for Belfast here from the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. And we're quite fortunate here in Belfast actually in being able to use historic maps, because the development of Belfast really owes much to the origins in the 17th century as a port town under the British at that time. And there's a whole series of maps over that intervening time period, which we can put together like a jigsaw to create that composite map on the right-hand side from the Irish Historic Towns Atlas for Belfast, which shows in different colours the different growth phases for Belfast, and basically using the maps as a way of recreating the development sequence represented by the different colours. There's another way of representing information about the past and past urban development on a map, and that's this is what we use for the British Historic Towns Atlases, a multi-period mapping where we have a single, what we call a core map, a kind of map which shows the layout of a particular town or city based upon the Ordnance Survey. So the background information is from the 19th century usually. And then we superimpose features from different historical periods in different colors using different conventions. So it's a different kind of way of visualizing time on a map, and it has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. But nevertheless, it's the model that we use as well as the French Historic Towns Atlas and also the Dutch Historic Towns Atlas. This is the model we chose. But whatever the visual format, other conventions are comparable across the Historic Towns Atlas series across Europe, especially in terms of scale. So what I want to say in the course of my talk this evening is a little bit about how we might begin to use historic maps to tell a story about urban places, about urban landscapes and how they've developed over time by focusing on historic maps. I want to draw a distinction here between, as you can see, between historic maps, which are maps from the past, compared to historical maps. Historical maps are interpretative maps. They're maps based upon historic maps usually, but they actually are selective in what they show about the past. So they are modern maps, in effect, of past periods of time, past periods of history. And the case here, we're looking at York, and it just indicates the difference between the historic map, the Ordnance Survey map, on which the atlas is based on the left-hand side, and the historical map in the Historic Towns Atlas for York on the right-hand side, which shows some sort of selection in the features that the map is showing here. So I want to draw a distinction then between historic and historical mapping, and I'm going to first of all deal with historic maps. For Chester, this is, not York. And also then historical maps based upon some of the work I've been doing with colleagues over the years on Chester. So I hope some of this will be of some interest to you. So there are really three parts of my talk, and they move through that past, present, future theme in the subtitle of my title for the talk this evening. So the first of the topics I want to talk about is mapping Chester through time, which is really a kind of journey through Chester's history using historic maps as a basis for that. And some of these maps I appreciate will be familiar to you, but maybe in some cases these maps may be less familiar. They are useful sources to us, of course, to tell us about Chester at particular points in time. So we can layer up these maps one on top of the other, so to speak, to undertake our traverse, if we want to use a surveying metaphor, our traverse through time, chronologically from the earliest to the more recent. Just a little cautionary note here, of course, from Brian Harley, a historian of cartography, who wrote some fantastic work in the late 80s about maps being selective and partial. You can read the long quotation there if you wish, but the key here is that maps are never value-free images. Maps are always selective. There's always a context. There's always a reason why a map is made. And we always need to be cautious, therefore, about using maps. Maps say as much about the map makers as they do about the places being mapped. Okay, so we need to think a little bit about the context for maps. And one thing I've been looking at recently, which I hope might be of interest here, is the relationship between maps and landscapes. We tend to use in landscape history maps as sources about landscapes, don't we? We tend to try and use an historic map to inform our view of what a landscape might have looked like at a particular point in time. What I'm trying to do at the moment in my research is think more about the landscape setting of the map's production. And this for Chester actually means we can begin to think rather differently about some of the maps which are connected to Chester, even if the maps themselves don't actually, in any detail anyway, depict Chester. So I'm thinking here of Higdon's Mappa Mundi, which is world renowned and quite rightly so, but has its origins in the 14th century in Chester. It now resides in California at the Huntington Library. But it was created by Ranulph Higdon, a monk of St. Werburgh's. And as you can see here, it was a really interesting attempt to try and visualize the geography of the known world in the 14th century as part of this Polychronicon, this historical text. So I'd like to use this really as just a way of reminding ourselves that maps are produced in locations, that there are these locales of cartographic production. And it's sometimes useful to resituate our maps in the context in which they were made. And if we do that, there are some interesting stories, I think, to be said about the relationships between landscapes and maps, which is a complex relationship based upon where the cartographer, the map maker, was situated. And it relates back to that quotation from Brian Harley to make us think a little bit more critically about the contexts of maps and the reasons why they were produced and by whom. So for Chester, of course, one of the earliest maps, and again, we might argue about what is a map, of course, and definitions of maps are always hotly contested. But using conventional terminology and definitions, then William Smith's depiction of Chester, which appears in this volume now at the British Library, a particular description of England. So William Smith himself, actually, I don't know if people know this here, but William Smith himself was from Cheshire. He's from Warmingham. I did my research. He's from Warmingham, actually. And we know he was a sort of person who was doing research, doing map making in the field, because there is an account of, I'm just reading my notes here, there's an account in his map of Bristol, there's an account that he measured and laid in platform this particular map by William Smith. At my being at Bristow, he says, on the 30th and 31st of July, 1568. So just a few years before the map of Chester, or the publication, or not publication, the creation of this particular description of England. So we need to think a little bit about how William Smith was operating. He was familiar with Cheshire, coming from Cheshire. We also know that he was somebody who was familiar with working in the landscape and thinking possibly about different kinds of ways, different technologies that maps were being produced in the 16th century using a plane table, for example. And in 1585, he was, in fact, in Cheshire, producing these maps, and I suspect also visiting the sites themselves. If we move further forward in time, as I'm going to do now, the Braun and Horgenberg map, which is, again, very well known map, actually seems to have some resemblances at least. And this brings me to an important point, actually, about maps and map making. There's a tendency for map makers, both in the past and in the present, to compile from different sources. So compilation is one way in which maps were made, and still are made, from different sources. We use compilation in our historic towns atlases, but also the importance of being in the field. So maps are also made through observation, through field work, through field survey. And there's a kind of balance there really in the production of maps between the field contribution and the compilation from different sources. And each map maker will have a slightly different approach depending on what sources are available to them, of course, and also their ability to be able to visit sites in the field. But this means maps can circulate far and wide and also be copied fairly readily. And in fact, copying was something, and still is something, which map makers are sometimes quite fearful of. So if we look a little bit later into the 17th century and John Speed, of course, so here we have Speed. Again, another Cheshire connection here for John Speed, who's born in Farndon in Cheshire in around 1551. So somebody again with familiarity with the county. And this is the little vignette, again, I'm sure familiar to many, from the Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain, which is his magnum opus, this great volume of county maps, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in most cases, there's a county town inset. And here's Chester. One thing which is worth bearing in mind or thinking about with all these maps is they are in effect perspectives. They're not planometric. They're not views from above. They're not looking straight down vertically, perpendicular to the ground, so to speak, like a modern map. They are instead oblique views towards the landscape. So they show buildings in a perspective view rather than a planimetric view. They also reflect as well a common viewing position. If you think about these three maps, they all actually view Chester from the same position and more or less also from the same angle across the River Dee, which helpfully for Chester is more or less north-south actually, which is of course a convention we're used to today, but certainly wasn't set in stone when these maps were made. So moving forward to Holler, Holler, again, an interesting Bohemian by origin, by birth, but Holler as well had a very close affinity to England in the 17th century. And this is his ground plot of Chester from 1653. By this time, he'd already undertaken a number of similar kinds of map-making exercises across England, as well as overseas as well. But again, that same viewing position and a lot of information relating to Chester and its classical origins, its ancient origins there as well. And then we move from the perspective views more towards the planometric. So this is the view from above. This is what we now would consider a modern map in a true sense, and that is a cartographic representation. An attempt to try and create a map to scale. This is de Laveau's map, plan of the city and castle of Chester from 1745. What's again quite striking about this map, and you'll see others as well, is the amount of countryside or rural areas, the fields, for example, which you see scattered around towards the periphery of these maps. As well as the urban centre itself. That seems to be another characteristic of these historic maps of Chester. Now, de Laveau himself, again, an interesting story here in how de Laveau ended up in Chester, and there's some speculation about this, about why he came to Chester. So de Laveau himself was previously actually mapping and responsible for mapping Suriname for the Dutch. in the middle part of the 18th century. And he also actually served time in prison in custody in America as well, before returning or coming to England. And one of the reasons why he might have found himself in Chester, apparently, if you look at the dedication there, the map is dedicated to George Cholmondeley, who was at that time Vice Admiral of Cheshire. And there seems to be a connection there because because of Dillebo's mother having Dutch ancestry. So these international connections running through these maps. Smith, for example, was in Nuremberg. The Brauner-Hornberg map was produced in Cologne. And then we have Dillebo here as well with international connections. So although we might try and localize these maps, it's nice to think, and it's interesting to think about the local connections. At the same time, these map makers were often influenced by outside sources as well, and techniques and methods and so forth in the creation of these maps. And moving forward again, then now we have a sequence from the 18th century, all fairly close in succession, and again following similar kinds of conventions. Again, planometric maps, again showing quite a lot of the field lands around Chester. And of course, they're showing themselves as well to reflect the changes in the urban landscape over time. The development of new suburbs, for example, the development of new infrastructure, the canal and Stockdale's plan of Chester here from 1796. And moving forward again into the 19th century, and those details begin to fill out. One of the other things I'd like to just draw your attention to in all of these historic maps we're looking at here from the 18th century and the early 19th century is how they represent the built-up area itself, the urban landscape. Instead of showing details of individual buildings, they tend to use a kind of stipple or hatch effect. So we can't actually see the details of often individual buildings unless they're key buildings like the abbey or church or something like that, or the castle. So they tend to obscure the details of the features that make up the urban landscape, the houses, in other words, the buildings themselves that front the streets. And they give an indication of the built-up frontages rather than the details, especially of the plots within which those buildings sit. And this is an important point I'm going to come back to in the second part of my lecture. So here we have now John Wood's beautiful, one of many plans actually for England, as well as he was most well known and associated with creating maps of Scotland and Scottish towns and cities. This is a plan of Chester from 1833. But again, notice still not much detail on the individual buildings within the walls of Chester and within the urban area as a whole. So by the time we get to the Tithe Maps then, the Tithe Maps are very interesting. They're available, as I'm sure many of us are familiar now with the online version of these, which is a terrific resource actually for Cheshire, thanks to Cheshire Archives. But the problem with Tithe Maps in reconstructing development in urban landscapes is that they're quite patchy. You can see the holes, as it were, in the map coverage here. And also if the parishes themselves don't have, they're sometimes left blank. Because the Tithe Maps, of course, are recording that information which is relevant to the collection of tithes for the church. So it's really only by the time we get to the middle part of the 19th century that we start to have detailed topographic maps for towns and cities of Great Britain, which show in a large amount of detail to a consistent scale, because all these maps are produced at different scales, different projection systems, different purposes. Think back to the Harley quotation, different reasons. So all of these things mean that ultimately the maps themselves are quite difficult to compare. We can think about their particular histories and how they might interconnect over time, but they are rather more difficult to use as sources in themselves and to compare because they all are produced for different kinds of reasons. Some of those reasons, of course, we don't necessarily always know. Whereas the Ordnance Survey, as the state mapping organization for Great Britain, and created or founded in the last part of the 18th century, produces maps, and it still produces maps, to a consistent scale. So the maps that are of particular importance to us in our work on landscapes of towns and cities, historic towns and cities, I would suggest are the scale of 25 inches to 1 mile, or these 1 to 500 scale plans. And these are from of Chester, as I'm sure you'll recognize. And you'll notice here the difference with some of those earlier examples I showed in terms of the level of detail, not only streets being shown and buildings, but importantly here, the plot patterns, the darker lines, you'll see them here, which show the boundaries between properties, the boundaries between buildings. These are hugely detailed maps and plans, and incredibly informative. We could almost walk down these streets using these maps in our mind's eye, walking down these streets thinking what they might have looked like in the latter part of the 19th century when the surveyors first surveyed these towns and cities, and then ultimately created the Ordnance Survey maps and plans from them. The letterbox, the names of the little lanes there, the pub, the Harp and Crown on the corner, the boundaries of parishes, as well as the boundaries of the properties, the tenements, the buildings around the courts, behind the street frontage, and the rows, of course, indicated here for Chester. So with the Ordnance Survey, then, we have a different kind of level of detail, which is really important to us in the mapping of historic towns and cities, and also ubiquitous scale and pretty much ubiquitous coverage, all of which are advantageous to us. But if we think about it, we can actually layer up our maps, thinking about what we're talking about here, and undertake our journey through time, moving from the known, as it were, from the 19th century to more distant times in the past, and using these different maps as ways of navigating, in this case, Chester's urban development, and thinking about how the maps tell a story about how the urban landscape has changed over time, as well as telling a story, of course, about how maps themselves have changed over time. There's a history of cartography here, as much as a landscape history of Chester. And as I said, I would really like to try and bring these two things together in some future research. It would be a fascinating thing to try and do. So what happens though if we want to try and reconstruct a map of Chester before Smith's of the 1580s? What happens then if we want to produce a map of Chester, let's say around 1500? And that was the point of the Mapping Medieval Chester project. We wanted to try and recreate a new map. This is a historical map now, of course, based upon historic maps, a compilation of historic maps and other information to produce a new map, an historical map showing Chester at 1500, at a point at which, of course, we don't actually have an extant map, certainly not a map to scale as this map purports to be. So the second part of my talk this evening, I want to move from the historic to the historical. And I'm going to do that by talking a little bit about these projects that you've maybe seen or heard about already earlier on in the talk. And I'm going to focus especially on thinking about what these maps tell us in terms of the shaping of Chester over time, and how we can use these detailed maps we're creating, our historical maps, to produce some new insights, some new research, which might then perhaps tell a slightly different story about how Chester developed over time, or at least to contribute to an existing historical literature on that. So I thought it appropriate for the society, for the Chester Landscape History Society, to have a quotation from that sort of founding father of landscape history, W.G. Hoskins, The Making of the English Landscape, and a quotation there, which he kind of slightly in The Making of the English Landscape. Remember, he's writing here in 1955, of course, bemoaning the fact that there were few scholarly books which said much about the physical growth of towns and cities, where their original core lay, the directions in which they grew, when and why, and what accounts for their street plan and shape today. What he's talking really here is about form, morphology, shape in an urban landscape. And what I want to try and show you here is how we can begin to use our historical maps to tell stories through the shapes and forms of urban landscapes which are represented on our historical maps. And as you'll see in a minute, this means having maps which show plot boundaries. And as Hoskins reminds us there, and I'm sure we all recognize now, how landscape is the richest historical record we possess. So we can use maps which as historic sources on landscapes, but we can also use maps to begin to visualize the landscape and to unlock the landscape's histories. What secrets we can find when we do that, when we begin to unlock the landscape through mapping it. Now, historians like Jane Lawton and The Life in a Medieval City for Chester is in a fantastic book, and the Victoria County History. There are lots of really good historical books and articles on Chester. But I would suggest there is a tendency in many of these works to use maps really as ways of really orientating the reader principally, rather than as a way of digging into a landscape's history. So in Jane Lawton's Chester 1500 map here, it looks quite an empty landscape. Yes, the buildings are shown, the streets are shown, the walls, the city walls are shown and so forth, the river, of course. But what's missing then are the built-up areas, the houses, the properties. What's missing there as well are the plots within which those buildings and properties were situated. And this is something which is actually quite common when in our histories of towns and cities. So the map on the right is from the Victoria County History and shows the fortifications, the Anglo-Saxon fortifications there with the churches, Holy Trinity there, at the former gates and St. Bridget's and St. Michael's, and then the expansion of the defensive circuit there later in the, well, when was that? 12th century, early 13th century, and the development of these the additional circuit walls around the western side of the city. But again, it's an empty looking landscape, isn't it? You know, it's devoid of buildings, it's devoid of plots. In this case, it's showing the city's walls. So maybe it might be forgiven, but then there are no other streets, it's just the walls that are shown. If we begin to populate our maps with more details, including, as you can see here, parish boundaries, the area of plot boundaries, so the street blocks themselves, the smaller streets as well as the larger streets, we begin to get a fuller picture of the urban landscape of Chester. And we can begin to do some interesting things, I would argue, once we get to a map which looks something like this. So this comes from Mapping Medieval Chester. So in our project, we produced a number of these maps, which are still accessible actually online if you want to have a look at them, for different themes, but they're all really focused on Chester circa 1500. That was the main focus of the project. So we have a map for 1500, showing you one I showed you earlier, with the area of the built-up area of Chester, both inside and outside the walls, the intramural and extramural areas, the religious buildings, the civic structures, and so on and so forth. And we produced maps, as I said, thematic maps for ecclesiastical Chester, highlighting the religious features of the city here, and what we call secular Chester, highlighting, for example, military or defensive features. So these are all available to you, but what I want to draw your attention to is that they all use details about the urban landscape, which were absent in some cases in some of those other maps we were looking at, apart from the Ordnance Survey map. And that's the importance of these plot boundaries. And the reason I think these are important is because plot boundaries give us some indication of the shape of a particular urban landscape. And I like to use, to illustrate this normally, and I use this with my students, Ludlow in Shropshire, again, another Marcher town, a really interesting place and well studied actually. In the aerial photograph there, you can see it as it is today. And this is called a plan analysis, where we identify the streets and the plot patterns, and we recognize that there are different forms in these street and plot patterns. They're not all in a kind of higgledy-piggledy mess. There's a kind of rationale to them. There's a way of using those plot patterns and street patterns to unlock an urban history, a landscape history for a particular locality, and to tell a story about the landscape, but using the landscape as a source. And this is what's called plan analysis, and it's based upon detailed study, analysis of historical Ordnance Survey maps and plans, just like those ones I showed you at Chester. This was the method that underpinned the creation of those maps of Chester of circa 1500 that we created for the project. And it's a method that owes much to this man, M.R.G. Conzen, who was a geographer who spent most of his working life at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, which is why he did a very detailed study of Alnwick in Northumberland. But he also actually worked on Ludlow as well, and built up a whole series of studies of Ludlow by visiting Ludlow in the field. And this again is an important component, I think, of our mapping work for Chester, is to return to the field, to the locality itself, and to draw from the landscape information, as well as compiling information from historic map sources. So for the case of our mapping medieval Chester maps, they're based on the Ordnance Survey 1 to 500 scale plan, with all of its details and with its accuracy. And we produced our maps using a geographical information system. And this, remember, was done about 10 or 15 years ago. Technology has moved on quite a bit since we did that work. So this now looks a little bit old-fashioned to me. Certainly the software has moved on quite a lot, but the principles are much the same. A geographical information system is a way of digitizing, in this case, digitizing historic maps and adding information to those historic maps digitally. And the thing about the GIS is it's really a great big database. It's a way of computerizing your mapping, but also producing new maps by linking together information from a variety of different sources, historic maps from archaeology, from documentary sources, and from field study as well. And all those little yellow dots you see there, those little yellow dots are the sites that we visited in the field. There's Lorraine Barry there. There's a picture of her here with the GPS kit, which we used to survey Chester as part of Mapping Medieval Chester. We walked all the way around the walls and we surveyed in particular features in the urban landscape. And then those features themselves can be used to help georectify, which is sort of basically orientating and stretching our historic maps, that they all sit in the right place. Because obviously all those historic maps relate to different projection systems and different scales and so forth. So in our GIS, we can bring them all together and layer them all up, one on top of the other, and use our control network, as it's called, our ground control network from the field survey, and make sure all of the maps sit perfectly on top of each other, at least perfectly as best we can. It just depends, of course, because some of these maps were not produced using scientific survey methods, so it will be more difficult to adjust them than in some cases than others. So we can piece together then these different maps using our geographic information system. And also we can create digital information based upon those maps. And this is where the GIS is really powerful as a tool, because not only can we, it's more than simply drawing a map on a computer. Each of these lines, they're called vectors, that we create using the GIS, which is where the map is being digitized here, is linked to, I seem to be seeing Alan Hume's screen. If Alan Hume, you could stop sharing your screen for a moment, that would be great. Can you hear me? There's a nice picture, a jolly picture there, I see, looking very sunny.
Keith, you'll have to reshare your PowerPoint now, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Is that visible?
Yeah, that's fine now.
Great. What I was talking about there was this process of digitizing the map, but very powerful method, because behind the map image there is a big database, and we can add information, as you can see there, from, in this case, the English Place Name Society volumes about particular streets, Eastgate Street in this case, as you can see. So our geographic information system is a compilation of different map sources from different periods, because what we're trying to do here is go from a 19th century map using historic maps, the ones you've seen earlier, back through time to the 16th century as best we can, which means removing streets and features which come from later periods, like Grosvenor Street. So we can peel those away using early historic maps, but all the time keeping the Ordnance Survey as our base map, because it's the most detailed and it's the most accurate as well. So we're also linking here archaeological maps as well. So here's a couple from Simon Ward's work. Simon was a real fantastic supporter for us in our projects on Chester, and was very, very helpful in providing us, the project team, with information, some published, some unpublished. This is published, of course, on the religious houses. But these site plans and the archaeological plans were really important in providing extra information, more detailed information about certain features in the urban landscape. All of these were brought together in our geographic information system, which you see here, looking rather, as I say, archaic now. And it was on the basis of that our cartographer at Queen's, Jill Alexander, produced what I think are beautiful maps, but not within not actually, it's not simply an output from the geographic information system. These are all based upon the information in the GIS, but all beautifully drawn by Jill as a cartographer. So this is our map of 1500 Chester. So this was the reason why in the map of medieval Chester, we put our maps at the heart of this project, because we were trying to connect the well-known and highly regarded historic texts about medieval Chester to new maps, the maps that we were creating. But I'd like to suggest as well, there are other things we can begin to do with these maps, which is something we might want to explore, which is to analyze the information that they show. So here's a little quotation from M.R.G. Conzen, who I mentioned already, about how there is risk involved if we simply categorize towns and cities based upon their shape or their form, to divide towns between irregular and regular types. He suggests instead we need to pay more attention to their morphological complexity. And this is something we can begin to do when we compare towns and cities using maps. So back to our Historic Towns Atlas, and this is Coventry, which I mentioned a little while ago, and some work that I've done on Coventry using our plan analysis method. Shows up an area to the south of the city, though the medieval city that was expanded deliberately under Ranulph de Blondeville, Earl of Chester, including the foundation of Greyfriars and other religious houses, and the suburban development to the south of the town centre as it was at that time. And again, if we think about what's going on in Chester and the similarities there, our morphological study, our study of shape and form, might begin to hint at some connections across these different towns, even though they're different towns, they're held by the same lords. So in the later 12th century, early 13th century, we see similar sorts of things going on in Chester with the development of religious houses to the west of the city. In that bit of land actually north of the castle, with the commercial focus more to the east in medieval Chester, there was this more kind of almost like a backwater sort of area actually, the crofts there, which were used for the foundation of these religious houses. So again, not dissimilar to what we just saw in Coventry. And we might use other examples of marcher towns like the Hereford Historic Towns Atlas to look at, again, comparisons between places. And again, thinking about similarities. The large marketplace outside the medieval defences, the early medieval defences of Hereford, is somewhat similar to the development of Foregate Street to the east of Chester. So these comparisons to be drawn if we study form and shape. What about, I mentioned the new towns were at Edward I, and of course Chester played a pivotal role in that conquest of Wales under Edward I in the late parts of the 13th century, the campaigns of Wales. And the quotation there is actually one which Edward would have been familiar with from Vegetius, from De Re Militari, about how rulers were renowned for founding cities or new towns, something which perhaps might have resonated with Edward, the young Edward at that time. And one of these towns founded, of course, was Flint, which is not that far from Chester. This is a whole host of new towns mapped through our Mapping Medieval Townscapes project I mentioned at the start, published in Antiquity. These are all plans drawn to the same scale for comparing all of Edward's new towns, have certain kinds of similarities, but also differences, and we can begin to analyze these. But with Flint itself, There is, again, in De Re Militari, an interesting point made in there about the layout of camps. And remember, of course, Vegetius is talking about Roman camps, but in Edward's mind, of course, is he not doing something similar as a military man trying to conquer Wales? So I think in Flint, again, we can begin to see perhaps some traces of perhaps Edward's thinking in the layout of these places. But equally, of course, he was himself based in Chester, and the layout of Chester is not, again, that different, that dissimilar to Flint. And it may be that not only is Edward influenced by what he's reading in Vegetius, but also about what he's seeing in the field, and the importance there perhaps of the layout of Chester with its rectilinear form, perhaps also having a resonance, a resemblance in that used for, I've twisted obviously Flint round to orientate it more to the orientation of Chester there to draw out those parallels. So morphology is really important, and it means actually having these details of streets and plots and buildings in our plans, in our maps, in our maps of medieval towns and cities. I'm going to end now with the future, looking forward, multimedia mappings, appropriately enough for these multimedia formats we're used to these days, and opening up the map. And I want to do that by thinking, first of all, about what it is to map. And there's a lovely quotation here from the late Dennis Cosgrove from his book Mappings, which reminds us that mapping is not just about the geometric, the cartographic, that we can sometimes use mapping in a metaphorical sense, like Boris's road map. It's not literally a road map out of lockdown. He's using mapping there in a metaphorical sense. And this is what Cosgrove is talking about here when he talks about mapping maybe spiritual, political, or moral, and not simply mathematical. So we can open up the map. And again, Chester's got a lovely example, which we looked at in Mapping Medieval Chester. Again, a quotation probably fairly well known to the audience here this evening. But the symbolic reading of the urban landscape by Lucian, the monk of Chester, de Lade Sestri, from around 1200, writing of the perfectly straight streets intersecting like the Blessed Cross, again, appropriate enough for this time of year, of course, and drawing parallels perhaps through that quotation between Chester, the earthly city, and the heavenly city of Jerusalem, which of course he would have been reading about in scripture. So there's a kind of symbolic, but also a metaphorical mapping of Chester from the medieval period, which we were interested in trying to relate back to maps of medieval Chester produced through our Mapping Medieval Chester project, the example on the right-hand side there. So to connect our textual maps with our to connect the textual mapping of Lucian with our visual maps of Mapping Medieval Chester is a way of opening up the map, as well as using interactive forms. So this is a poem in praise of Chester, which was part of our website, which is still accessible actually. And we're trying to relate the maps to the texts to help us to navigate our way through the urban landscapes of those who lived in Chester, 500 years ago. And at the heart of this was our GIS, our Geographic Information System, and all of that information, the compilation, the field work, the use of historic maps, the creation of new maps, a historical map for Chester. And this was available online. But again, now, with the passage of time, of course, this looked fairly old-fashioned, quite clunky. So we were keen, through Discover Medieval Chester, to repurpose, is the word that's used these days, to kind of recycle and upgrade Mapping Medieval Chester's web mapping to create Discover Medieval Chester, and to use the map itself as a way of navigating around the city for tours, for example. And here's one of the real strengths of using these multimedia mappings. They enable us to juxtapose the medieval and the modern. We can overlay a medieval map of Chester created through that project onto a modern aerial photograph to connect past to present. That's a very powerful device. It reminds us of the continuities in the urban landscape. It enables us to look at the urban landscape both from the perspective of today, the 21st century, but also from the perspective of the past. And it underlines again the importance of having accurate ground control networks in our GIS, because if our ground control network was wrong, then these maps, these two representations would not overlay each other perfectly. But the future then also, perhaps there's some work to be done in, again, using Discover Medieval Chester as a basis for creating new content. We've just, through the Historic Towns Trust, been working with friends and colleagues in Coventry as part of Coventry's UK City of Culture Year, and Medieval Coventry there, Mark Webb in particular, to create a new map of Coventry, which was originally published in 1975 for the Historic Towns Atlas then, but it's now been completely redrawn by Giles Darks, cartographer for the Historic Towns Atlas series and the Historic Towns Trust. And this now has been made available online through a new resource called Coventry Atlas. So these are the kinds of things, wearing again my Historic Towns Trust hat on, I would love to do with Chester. I'd love to be able to see a new contribution to our series of printed volumes, British Historic Towns Atlas volume of Chester, if there's sufficient interest, and I really hope there will be. And also the possibilities through working with us as well of creating maps. We produced a series of folding maps, we call them, for about £10, very hopefully affordable to many people and accessible for tourists, for local people to use, for tour guides to use, for school kids to use, for teachers to use, and so on and so forth. These are great things to have. So I'm going to end there with these questions, really. If we are going to continue to think a little bit about, and I hope we are, about the possibility of creating a new Historic Towns Atlas for Chester, there are some questions there. I don't propose necessarily we answer those this evening, of course, but I simply put them there in case there's people in the audience this evening who might be interested in this idea of a Historic Towns Atlas for Chester, about developing it as an idea, thinking about partnerships, who might write it, who might compile it, how the maps are made, and what the timescale might be. So that's the end of me. Thank you very much for your time and also for your patience. Appreciate it. I've been talking now for an hour, and you've missed your lovely evening in Chester as well, enjoying